What is going on, everybody? This is Alex Fergnani, and I welcome you to another episode of the 4Sight Chats series. In this season of the series, I'm having conversations with leading experts in futures and foresight and related fields. Today, I'm talking about the present situation and the futures of the issue of crisis in management education and of business schools more broadly, with one of the most vocal advocates of this topic at a global level, Dennis Tourish. Dennis is a professor of leadership and organization studies at the University of Sussex Business School. He is also the editor of the journal Leadership. Dennis has written several books and journal articles, including a book that is very relevant to this conversation, titled Management Studies in Crisis, Fraud, Deception, and Meaningless Research, and also an award-winning article with the evocative title of The Triumph of Nonsense in Management Studies. In this conversation, Dennis gives a very useful summary of the various interlinked problems behind the crisis in management education. We talk about which problems are most serious, about possible futures of the situation, and of course about possible solutions to address the issue collectively, such as doing more relevant research, a faster and better review process, lottery-based grant allocation for researchers, and more. So, I hope you will enjoy the conversation. Dennis, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Alex. I look forward to our conversation.
So do I. So I'm going to start with some statistics. Usually I don't do that, but this problem we're going to talk about seems quite dire, and I think some statistics might actually help. In an AOM survey, it was found that the majority of business schools scholars believed that multidisciplinary research has greater impact than single discipline research. Yet, top-tier journals in management are monodisciplinary. The majority also believe that top-tier journals lists and impact factor either probably or definitely don't speak for journal quality, yet business schools still use them for promotion and tenure decisions. In an editorial published in the Academy of Management, Learning and Education, it was noted that few management academics accept that they have to inform the general public and rarely feature in the public discourse. Several authors, you including, say that we need metrics not just for impact, but also to measure how researchers and managers solve problems together. And finally, in a very interesting article recently published on still the Academy of Management, Learning and Education by Fergnani and colleagues, it was found that measuring the output of a scholar using the top-tier journal impact factor is misleading because it implies a conflation of levels of analysis, and that is using a journal-level metric to assess scholar-level output. In fact, using journal impact factor overestimates the impact of average scholars and underestimates the impact of exemplary scholars, and that is because citations in those top-tier journals are heavily skewed to the right. Most people do not have much citations, most authors do not have much citations, and there is a small number of scholars who have a lot of citations. Now, this is what I found to be some interesting statistics that I gathered around this problem that you called the problem of management studies in crisis. You have been one very strong advocate about this problem. You have written a very interesting book titled Management Studies in Crisis, and also an excellent article still in the Academy of Management, Learning and Education, which also sparked an interesting debate on the same subject. So Dennis, can you give us a brief overview of the problem, as if you were speaking to someone new to the field, such as a PhD student who just started a PhD in a business school?
Well, thank you for that summary of some of the problems that we face. I think our field is beset by very many problems. First of all, I start with the assumption that management and organizations matter to the overall welfare of humanity and to the health of the economies within which we live and work. So it's an important subject. It's also an intrinsically interesting one. Organizations are full of emotions, conflict, despair, love, hatred. Many of them are in trouble. They cease to exist. New ones come into being all the time. And yet I think that most writing in our journals on these issues is incredibly boring, written in a jargon-ridden manner, which seems to find favour with reviewers and editors of journals, but which erects barriers to communicating clearly with the wider public. And by the wider public, I don't just mean practicing managers. I think we should be able to produce information and knowledge that is helpful to anybody who is interested in principle in management and organizations, and that would include trade unions, other pressure groups, and the wider public. I'm not saying that everything should be intelligible to such a wide audience, but I'm saying we should make the effort, and our work should be as complex as it needs to be, but no more complex. So that's one issue. And I think part of the reason why such very, very poor quality writing dominates the field is that our top-tier journals, so-called top-tier journals, in general prioritize what they call the development of theory above anything else. They don't prioritize, for example, implications for society or the intrinsic importance of the topic. They prioritize theory development. Now, theory development is actually quite difficult. So in order to pretend that we're doing it, many of us adopt a very convoluted prose style. And we've had a lot of discussion in the last while about imposter syndrome in academia, where well-qualified people feel that they're perhaps underqualified, and therefore that they're just pretending to be suitable for the job. But in my AMLI article that you referenced, I suggested that many of us have become what I call genuine imposters. That is, that we're pretending to be doing more important work than we are. And we're pretending to be addressing more important issues than we really are. And we're pretending to develop theory in a manner that does not actually stand by the facts. So that's an issue. And in order to secure publication, I think management academics, like academics actually beyond our discipline, but I am particularly aware of it in ours, engage in a whole range of what I describe as questionable, not only I, but other people describe as very questionable research practices, which we can talk about later if you like.
Yeah.
And I think you very ably identified some of the sources of this problem at the beginning. The problem is the overemphasis that is now put on where we publish rather than what we publish. And as you suggested, the data shows that things like journal impact factors are a very poor guide to the quality of individual publications within them. So therefore, why do we use them? And I think we use them simply because a culture of audit has taken deep root within academia, a culture of distrust, of suspicion, and of measurement. And university managers rely on forms of measurement, like a reliance on journal impact factors or so-called journal ranking systems that tend not to be really valid, but they're very easy to use. And that helps to explain why they have become so prevalent within our area. The end result is that much of what we publish isn't really relevant to the world as a whole. I have discovered, for example, that if you look back to the 2008 Great Recession, the majority of the so-called top-tier journals in management and organization studies, including those published by the Academy of Management, have published nothing that deals with it. I think Academy of Management, Learning and Education is one exception, which has published one article on that topic. And to me, that's a disgrace and a terrible reflection on the overall health of our discipline, that we tend to ignore the really big problems in order to engage in bite-sized chunks of research that we feel, rightly or wrongly, are more likely to find rapid publication in elite journals. In a nutshell, that's my vision of the problem.
Yeah. It's fascinating because we have an incentive system that skewed the willingness of scholars to produce impactful research, and now it's very difficult to change. I remember it was Friedrich Nietzsche who said madness is rare in individuals, but in groups it's the norm. And it's funny that we ended up literally right there. I mean, there is a quote from your book that I just want to mention, because I guess this will really entice people to go and read it. Trivial insights are converted into theoretical statements that read like English translated into Esperanto, and then back again, in both cases by a malfunctioning software program. I mean, I had fun reading your book because in more than one occasions, I could think that you could turn this into a stand-up sketch, no jokes. It's actually fun to read, but it's also quite depressing, right? Because we have an incentive system that is completely upside down at the moment. So it's quite tough. You called it technocratic unimaginativeness. I think this is also quite an interesting term I found in your book, because we try to produce theory. Not all the time it's actually possible to churn theory out of an empirical paper, right? And then we end up creating this sort of papers of research that is rather disconnected to practice, and it's a lot of mumbo jumbo. But I want to ask you this. You have identified a lot of problems, and just to mention a few: obsession with university ranking, obsession with impact factor, low quality and lack of relevance of research, the fact that high impact factor is correlated with low reliability, coercion of reviewers and journals editors to cite them during the review process, research misconduct in various forms, and others. I want to ask you something. Is there one or two problems that you would single out as the real evil? In other words, if we take a complexity view of the situation, a complex system of problems, like a wicked problem, that's how we call it, there is usually a leverage point where we can change the system quite significantly by doing away with that or those one or two critical problems. So what do you think is that leverage point, that thing that we really need to do away with?
Well, I'll answer this in two parts, if I may. The first part is that I think the overwhelming thing that drives these difficulties is an over-reliance on impact factors and journal ranking systems. These have become a disease within academia. For example, there are now very many journal ranking systems that are used in different countries. The main one I am aware of is the Association of Business Schools Journal Rankings Guide, which appears in the UK, but there are many, many others. I have occasionally suggested to colleagues that, well, we now have so many of them that what we need is a ranking of journal ranking systems, and then furthermore, a ranking of the ranking of journal ranking systems, and so on, ad infinitum. Well, I think that this is preposterous and damaging.
It's dystopian as well, right? I mean, you can think of a very dystopian future where the obsession brings to the ranking of ranking. It seems like we're reading George Orwell.
Yes, it has become absolutely absurd. Now, that's one side of it. But the other side of it, in terms of a problem, is that I think many management academics have become too complicit in this. We don't yet live in a totally dystopian state. We still have some freedom of maneuver as individuals and as groups. For example, in principle, there's nothing to stop us engaging in much more meaningful work. In addition to that, something seems to happen that in some business schools, maybe beginning with PhD programs, people are encouraged to develop an absolute obsession with publishing in a tiny handful of elite journals. And they develop the conviction that if they do not do so, they won't have an academic career.
Yeah.
That simply isn't the case. We need to be very careful as individuals to set our goals that are in line with the aspirations that bring us into academic life in the first place. Very few people come into academia intending to become multimillionaires. We are driven by other things like intellectual curiosity, the desire to write, the desire to make a difference to the world, the desire to solve real problems, and so on. Now, I think that we have an obligation to keep those at the forefront of our minds. And it's absolutely perfectly possible for people to have rewarding careers in good institutions without necessarily publishing regularly in, for example, Academy of Management Review or Organization Science and the equivalent, might not get you a job at Stanford or Cambridge in the UK or whatever. But then why does that have to be the be all and the end all? So I think that fetishizing of career objectives is a little bit of a problem, and it's something that we can do something about, and which many academics do. There still is very good work out there that is being published, and we need to cherish that and do more of it.
You know, I think it was Herman Aquinas in one of his articles. He said, this is a problem of each one of us. So in other words, yes, a lot of people think that it's only the dean that is supposed to take a yes, decision, and only the top level journal editors or gatekeepers that are supposed to take a decision. But in reality, it's a problem that even if, you know, the small little lecturer in a third tier university starts to be vocal about, and if a lot of people do that, it will become a trend. So I guess we are underestimating our agency in this. I also want to bring another quote. I'm trying to find it. Another quote from your book about this aspect, that we are underestimating our agency. You have mentioned an episode of some scholars after a comment about the misleading nature of citation indexes. And one scholar said, what's the point of making a fuss about this? It's like arguing against the force of gravity. And the other said, yeah, it's like saying, we don't like the force of gravity, let's resist it. What do you respond to this?
Well, I think that's nonsense. You know, those quotes, they were actually taken from an article by a colleague, I think it might have been Alexandra Bristow, who reported on a seminar, and she heard these types of comments immediately afterwards. But I think they highlight a widespread perception in academia that we are more or less the powerless victims of circumstance and systems that are beyond our control. Moreover, these systems have become, in a way, naturalized. The assumption is that because they're there, they can never be changed. But, you know, let's face it, things like journal ranking systems are a fairly recent phenomenon.
That's right.
They weren't here 20 or 30 years ago. And I have a feeling that in the UK, the ABS Journal Guide is becoming less critical, less the focus of debate and attention than it used to be, because its manifest absurdities are becoming more obvious. I mean, for example, it tends to rank, it has identified a tiny number of so-called super elite journals. It just so happens that those super elite journals are all American. That's intellectually preposterous. And it means that a certain type of scholarship is being prioritized and advocated and advanced beyond others. So we don't have to go along with that. We still have a lot of freedom of choice. But I do think that the language that we use often perpetuates these ridiculous outcomes. For example, many scholars still refer to what they call the publishing game. I have argued very strongly against that particular metaphor, because I think our scholarship matters much more than a game. I think it should matter much more than a game. And I think every time we use that metaphor in our conversations with each other, we are trivializing academic activity. We're reducing it to the level of what ultimately is a very unimportant football match or a game of tennis or something of that kind. And if we accept that mentality, by the way, then it means that why not just engage in unethical or unfair research practices? It doesn't matter anyway. We might as well engage in p-hacking, or we might as well engage even in a little tiny bit of research fraud in order to secure publication. After all, it's only a game, and it doesn't really matter. I think too many scholars have sadly capitulated to the idea that it doesn't really matter. We might as well just do anything in order to get published. I think that's neglecting the freedoms that we still enjoy. I think it's irresponsible. I think in the long run, it's unsustainable, because ultimately we are using public money of one kind or another to sustain our activities. And when it becomes ever more obvious that what we're actually producing is a lot of irrelevant scholarship, then the game will be up. We can't indefinitely claim all the resources that are taken up, and there are many, an academic activity, unless it becomes a little bit better than it actually is and has a deeper purpose than simply playing the game.
Yes, and with this, you are leading me into thinking about the negative future that could come out of this, because if eventually it is so clear that business schools are losing relevance, then there is not the best case scenario out there for us as business school researchers. So let's try to think of taking a foresight gear. If we had to think about a possible negative future and a possible positive future where things are turned around. And of course, again, this is very simplified. Supposedly, we ought to do more than and to design more than one future to understand how this could evolve and unfold. But if we had to simplify and think about a worst case scenario where business schools are losing their relevance, and a best case scenario where business schools regain their relevance, how would those two look like to you? And perhaps in the best case scenario, you might also want to talk about a few solutions.
Well, a worst case scenario would be that where we are at the moment remains and simply intensifies, so that we have even more irrelevant, poorly written and pretentious scholarship filling our journal pages. Associated with that, we would continue to neglect really important issues like, for example, climate change, the biggest challenge in many respects facing our species, but again, an issue in which management and organizational scholarship has remained largely silent. But there are alternatives that are there and that are emerging. Now, among the things that encourage me are that you mentioned that I published an article on these issues in the Academy of Management, Learning and Education. The response was overwhelming. I had well over 100 emails from scholars around the world on the issue, including—
I was one of them.
You were one of them, yes. And it included communications from some very prominent scholars, including at least 2 former presidents of the Academy of Management, all expressing their concerns about these issues, agreeing fundamentally with what I said, and pointing to various things that they were doing to try and address them. That was important. Yeah. Now, part of what is addressing this, and I take great encouragement from this, is that, for example, a former AOM president, Anne Suey, has launched the Responsible Research and Business and Management Network, or rbm.com. I encourage listeners and viewers to look it up, which does its best to promote more responsible and meaningful research using appropriate methods and addressing important issues. It's had quite a big impact. The fact that it's had such an impact tells me that not only is there widespread concern about these issues, but there is a growing determination to do something about it. And in fairness to the Academy of Management as well, they've expanded they have established a growing roster of journals, not all of them utterly fixated on so-called theory development, and some of them actually quite accessible and publishing very interesting material. So these are like straws in the wind of what can and what is being done by many people. But I think all of us can play a part in this. And I come back to this question of our individual agency. Instead of just following boring topics, small topics, I would encourage PhD students and beyond that early career researchers not to lose sight of what originally brought them into academic life, and to make a commitment afresh to doing meaningful, responsible, important research. And if it doesn't end up in organization science, it will end up in other good journals, and they will be able to have satisfying careers. I mean, what's the alternative for us as individuals is to do work that ultimately not just bores everybody else, but bores ourselves as well. And an academic career is too long to face that kind of prospect with equanimity.
Oh, this is awesome. I mean, we do have directions. You know, I also read a few more propositions by you. I remember you are a strong advocate of a shorter review process, or at least a review process that doesn't drag too much, because it is in those very long review processes that scholars are literally incentivized to create that theoretical nonsense that you talk about. So that's probably one thing I remember.
Let me just say, by the way, that I'm entirely in favor of theory development. It's a good thing. What I object to is that for many journals it's over prioritized and it becomes the only thing that matters. That's what I object to.
Thanks for disambiguating. Absolutely 100% there with you. Theory is just the basis of everything. In fact, in reverse, I have been a strong advocate of creating theory in the field of organizational foresight. As you might know, I published a paper that got 10 responses to that because, if you think about this in a flipped version, organizational foresight is no theory. So when theory is lacking, then it's certainly something we need to pay attention to. But yeah, the over prioritization is another thing. I also wanted to ask you about this. You mentioned in your book that one of the policies that we could implement is to allocate grants based on lotteries, which is a very interesting concept because there is a lot of evidence showing that if we try to allocate resources based on merit, it's actually not necessarily beneficial, or it is not as beneficial as it would be by doing it randomly, which is quite an interesting evidence there, right? So you actually mentioned that it would be desirable to set certain basic criteria, right, to allocate grants, and then after proposals have passed that criteria, you could actually assign grants by lottery. Is that something that is feasible?
Well, I'm not the only person to raise that type of idea for debate and discussion. At the moment, writing grant proposals takes up a huge amount of time. Excellent proposals are routinely refused funding,
Right.
simply because there's a very relatively small pot of money that people are competing against each other for. The amount of effort that goes into writing these things and then reviewing them is absolutely enormous. So I'm not arguing for a totally random process, but as you say, if a certain basic threshold of quality is reached, then we might as well resort to something random because it's random anyway. It's just that we get there by a very roundabout method involving a huge expenditure of labor. The hope is that something like that would eliminate a lot of the wasted time that goes into the system. Other ideas that are out there include giving pretty much all academics some kind of grant income at the beginning of their careers, especially as a matter of course, and then seeing what happens with that and how they spend it and what outcomes emerge at the end. You also mentioned the review process.
Yeah.
And yes, I do think that the review process in many of our so-called leading journals has become too prolonged and adversarial and ends up distorting what it is that people are attempting to say. And 3, 4, 5, 6 rounds of reviews, in my opinion, are a huge waste of everybody's time. I think that it should be possible after 2 rounds of R&Rs to make a decision in principle about whether a paper will end up being published. That doesn't mean that a little bit more work might not be required, but certainly the decision could be made in principle, and that would forestall this escalation of commitment that goes on the part of editors, reviewers, and of course authors themselves. Might even help us to enjoy the process a little bit more than we currently do. At the moment, it feels often like hell submitting to a leading journal.
Yeah, I heard a lot of that. Look, these are amazing measures. They would really reframe the incentives because if you think about it, we have at the moment a skewed way to allocate resources based on merit that is arguably wrongly assessed, right? We allocate resources to those who merit them, assuming that those who merit them have published on top tier journals, right? This is a whole assumption. But if these articles on top tier journals are overly theorized, as you explained, then perhaps the pursuit of that kind of merit is misguided. So that's a very interesting measure.
I mean, it's not just that they're over theorized as well, but I often think that in many ways, researchers now, there's such a strong bias in favor of publishing positive results that many studies are actually designed so that only positive results are possible. I read a paper a little while ago, for example, on loneliness in the workplace. And when you dig beneath the convoluted language, and it was very convoluted, what you find is that what I found was that the hypotheses were tautologies. That is, they were just stating the same thing twice. So among the findings in this paper were that lonely employees in the workplace don't talk very much to their fellow employees. Stripped of the jargon, that's what it amounted to. But nevertheless, it was published in a top journal. And sadly, that type of thing is not exactly uncommon. But the verbiage enables it to appear as a theoretical contribution and as something that is practically significant. So much of that work isn't practically, not all of it, not all of it, but enough of it to be troublesome. And we could be doing a hell of a lot better if we put our minds to it, and if the incentives were a little bit changed, and if the journals adopted different practices. So I think we also need different forms of writing in our journals, for instance. One of the reasons why they're so tedious and boring to read is that they all tend to follow the same template. So we have the abstract, we have the introduction, we have the research methods, we have the results, and we have the discussion. Right. And that works well for many papers, but it does not work well for them all. So I think we need a lot more variety in A, what we write about, and B, how we write about it. So for example, my tenure is coming to an end, but I'm currently the editor of the journal Leadership, which specializes in publishing critical work on leadership. Quite recently, we published an article about a leadership development program, which took the format of a 3-act play in which leading philosophers interrogated some of the assumptions behind the leadership development program in question. It was fun to read. It was academically very, very rigorous. There was a lot of deep theoretical substance to it, but it was written in a novel format that immediately attracts the eye of the reader and draws people in to the very compelling story and analysis that it offered. I think we should have much more variety of that kind in our journals, and sadly at the moment we don't, which is why many of us read our journals in the same way, I think, that many people eat brown rice in misery, but just hoping that it will do us some good. And quite often, unfortunately, it doesn't.
Couldn't agree more. You know, the most interesting papers I read were abductive papers usually. And the serendipity that is found in those papers, it really engages the reader to just go on. And it's very, very interesting. And it's also a very way to transparently produce research. Like in an abductive paper, you might want to find A and you end up finding B, and it's actually still very interesting, but you transparently report that, and it ends up being something useful and usually practical. And you know, this is very similar to Van de Ven engaged scholarship, the idea of abductively trying to find solutions to problems. So we go in an organization, we look at the problems first, we think that the problem is A, we end up finding that the problem is B, but then there is a solution at the end of the tunnel. So those papers are excellent, and oftentimes they do include detailed and thick descriptions of case studies, which, if written well, they're very informative, but also that's probably another topic. They seem to be oppressed and looked down on in those top journals.
Yeah. I mean, various scholars have commented, especially in my subdomain of leadership studies, the overwhelming preference for the use of survey instruments rather than for thick description or immersion in an organization. I mean, there are many reasons for that, but one of them is that administering a survey is relatively quick and easy. But what it doesn't necessarily do is capture the details of what is actually happening in an organization. And I think it leads to very many false positive findings actually as well. So as I say, I think a large part of the problem is that many researchers now design studies that don't just increase the likelihood of positive results, but where only positive results are possible. And that is another dereliction of duty in terms of the academic commitments that we should actually pursue.
Right. And well, on the top of that, positive results might be inflated by p-hacking that you discuss at length in your book. And, you know, I was thinking about the necessity of perhaps focusing on other measures of probability testing, because we have a lot of evidence showing that in many circumstances, Bayesian statistics is actually better than significance testing.
And I mean, you're probably aware that this is part of a wider crisis of reproducibility and replication in the social sciences. Psychology has been particularly known for it, but I have no reason to imagine that it's any less a problem in management studies. We just don't go out of our way to try and replicate so-called key findings. If we did, I think we might find ourselves in the middle of a horror story.
So Dennis, I'm curious, this is a problem that we have to address. The problem to a certain extent is a collective problem. So it has to be addressed collectively. And my fear is that even if we try to encourage small pockets of individuals, small pockets of scholars to address this and being more vocal in their university, if there is no agreement on how to move forward, right? This is actually very difficult to solve. So what are your thoughts on addressing the problem collectively? And when I say collectively, I want to just define it a bit further. I mean, in a way that encourages better research to be done, but at the same time is forgiving of the previous game play, right? And takes into account that some people have played the game and you don't want to kill them and cut their legs halfway, right? So that way we can achieve a collective agreement. So how do you see that moving forward?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think that we have to do it. It's imperative. If we don't do it, we will end up maybe a little bit like what the field of social psychology in particular has become in the last few years, really beset with a huge public credibility crisis, because so much attention has inevitably surfaced about things like replicability and the exposure of a few key fraudsters in the field who published so-called groundbreaking research, which turned out to be entirely faked. So how do we move forward collectively? Well, first of all, let's recognize that the problem is not absolute and everywhere. There are interesting journals out there that have a good reputation, that publish good, valuable, responsible research. I'm thinking about journals like the Journal of Management Inquiry, which is an American journal, which I rate very highly. I think the Academy of Management, Learning and Education as well is an outstanding journal, actually, that has published some of the much more meaningful research over the last few years in our field. I think there's a number of specifically critical journals like Leadership, which has published some very, very important work on its subject area over the past while. So those tokens of progress exist in the field. I have also already mentioned the Responsible Research and Business and Management Network. I take great heart from that, and from the fact that very many prominent management academics have become involved in that. I think a huge number of very experienced scholars are publicly speaking out on this issue. You mentioned Herman Aquinas, for example, who I think was quite recently president of the Academy of Management in America. Herman has written some very, very important work on all of these issues. And the more prominent scholars of that quality speak out, the better it is, because it helps to create different norms within our field. There is a need for professional management associations like the Academy of Management, the British Academy of Management, and others to more publicly and formally debate these issues and make public commitments as well to progress. Now, for example, the RRBM network invites institutions to endorse its principles, and it lists institutions that have done so, and it has recognized some of them as pioneering institutions on these matters. Very proud and happy to say that the University of Sussex Business School, where I work, is one of those as well. So we need to do more to push all those initiatives forward. But I also come back to, it's not just a question of saying we will change our habits when collective bodies make progress and it no longer is difficult to do so. At an individual level and at an early career research stage, we need to take these steps. I have sometimes heard people say, it's all very well for you to say this, you're a tenured professor and so on, but what about me? I have to play the game and do X, Y, and Z. And my answer is no, you do not have to play the game. You don't have to use that language. You most definitely don't have to say that unless I publish papers in a handful of top-tier journals, then I don't feel fulfilled as an academic. There are all these other outlets that are there that you can do good work and publish it within. So I would say the answer is a combined one. It's action at that collective level. It's also at the individual level. And it boils down to us refusing to lose touch with those ideals, and they are ideals, that tend to bring most of us into academic life in the first place. We didn't become academics to lose them. Let's not do so.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Dennis. So let's talk about resistance, because all those are amazing endeavors and measures. But while you were talking, I am hearing scholars that play the game talking back to you, right? Resistance that we have seen also in the replies to your AMLE, Academy of Management, Learning and Education article. So I'm curious about how do you feel about those responses that were not so favorable, and how do you feel about whether they're truthful or not?
Yeah. Well, the majority of the responses that were published in AMLI as a follow-up to my article were favourable and positive. There was one that was outrightly hostile, and one or two critical comments that are okay in the others. I think that there still is a feeling of complacency on the part of many academics about the state of our field. Many of them have also been handsomely rewarded for that horrible phrase, playing the game.
Yeah.
And they've become schooled and habituated into doing just one or two forms of research, survey instruments, for example, that yield publication in top journals. And as other scholars have discussed it, it's a perverse form of natural selection that takes place. If you prosper and progress by these means, then the system feels entirely natural and comfortable to you. Why would you be willing to change it? So I think that part of the resistance is this complacency on the part of established academics. I also, to be absolutely honest about it, think that another problem in our field is that a significant number of quite prominent academics do a lot of consulting work. And that's facilitated if they can sell so-called easy solutions to large corporations and private sector companies. I'm thinking specifically about so-called authentic leadership theory in my subdomain, which is associated with a survey instrument, the Authentic Leadership Questionnaire, which I think is fatally flawed. And statisticians who have looked at it have been very critical of it as well. But it enables people to create a brand for themselves and then go off and earn significant amounts of money by being associated with that particular brand. It's not accidental, by the way, that a number of papers on that particular theory published in the top tier journal, Leadership Quarterly, were retracted a couple of years ago because the statistical analysis behind them just didn't withstand scrutiny.
But the consulting still goes on.
Yeah, I think those are some of the reasons why there's that type of resistance. There's always people who benefit from any dysfunctional system and who defend it and who do not want to change. But I think the voices clamoring for change are growing in number and growing in volume. And there is the beginnings of a movement for change that is out there that we should all take courage from.
Well, indeed, let's hope that this conversation will also bend some attention your way and towards your work. So among the other things, you also advocate for more practical research. So you say that research in management should address the social challenges of today and how they reflect on the world of organizations. And there are a lot of those challenges, including automation of tasks, potential loss of work identity, especially in view of the metaverse, the necessity of universal basic income, financial crisis, climate change, and so on. So it's actually tough for a management scholar to do research in these areas, given that very few scholars at the moment are able to advise new students on those areas, right? The expertise in our field is actually quite limited.
But what an opportunity that is.
It's a great opportunity. Tell me about it. How do we move forward in that space?
Yeah, well, I think there's a terrible temptation for early career scholars to try and settle on an area of study at an early stage of their career and then stick with it. And they're encouraged, for example, I study diversity. I'm a diversity scholar. I study identity. I'm an identity scholar. And some people end up basically writing variations on the same paper for many, many years. I think that's a terrible, boring prospect and a waste of their talent. So we need to ask big questions about important issues that have uncertain answers. And I think the fact that not many people have yet written enough on things like the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution opens up enormous opportunities for scholars to engage in those fields. It would be an excellent thing if more of them took up that task. My colleague Mats Alvesen has also written about the norm within our field of what he calls gap spotting versus problematizing. In other words, people are encouraged to spot tiny, tiny little gaps in the literature and then go about filling them instead of challenging, that is, problematizing core ideas and findings in the field. And the problem with this gap spotting approach is obvious. that sometimes the gaps are totally unimportant and they haven't been filled before because nobody cares whether they're filled or not. But nevertheless, if you can identify a gap and then claim to be filling it, it appears to facilitate the drive towards publishing. And the problem with that, of course, is that you end up publishing for its own sake. And you end up with the most tiny, relatively trivial and unimportant additions to knowledge within the field, rather dull prospect that is there. So what about the big issues like climate change, the fourth industrial revolution, the banking crisis, the ongoing dominance of neoliberalism in terms of an ideology within society that facilitates very totalitarian forms of management within organizations? Why don't we write about all of that? Why don't we write about that, study it, research it, talk to people, embed ourselves within different environments? It will be a hell of a lot more fun and a lot more rewarding than filling yet another tiny gap around something that has already been researched to death.
I feel like I want to provide a caveat to that, because I'm one of those people who never accepted the game and started to at least try to pursue some meaningful research since my PhD, in fact. And I have, as you know, I've pursued the area of foresight, organizational foresight so far, which I believe is an extremely relevant topic.
I agree.
But yet it's not a top topic, so to speak, in a top tier journal. So the caveat to that is that it's usually very difficult to publish on those areas because there is resistance to a new topic, right? So that has to be said. I feel like I have to say that because I face that. But yet there is also hope in this caveat, because once the topic is established and once the topic is out, then the rewards are usually way bigger than what would be filling the gaps, right? Filling the gaps in and of itself is, it's a skill set that is useful only for filling the gap. So there is no externality, but creating a new topic of research and encouraging research in that space can actually be very rewarding. And usually I since the very beginning was very much encouraged by one of my mentors at NUS Business School, a scholar that you might know, Michael Fries. And Michael always told me, just keep going, because even if now it's super difficult for you to publish and you face resistance, both at the reviewer and at the editorial level, eventually the citations will be much larger than the typical paper. So this perhaps is a caveat with hope.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And it might be more difficult to publish such material in so-called top-tier journals, but there will always be an outlet for it.
Indeed.
And given the way that we now use search terms and keywords when we're looking for papers of interest, it's perhaps just a little bit less, not totally, but a little bit less important precisely where we publish to have an impact.
Yes. So Dennis, as our time together draws to a close, I want to ask you a last question. Is anything that's changed in your thinking about this problem since you published your great book and since you've written the article? Is there anything that you'd want to tell us that you have been updated on?
I don't think my thinking has fundamentally changed, but my attitude has. I have become a little bit more optimistic because of the response that I have received from people, the invitations to speak about these issues. Last week, I was in a management school somewhere else in the UK, talking about it, for example, to a large group of management academics. The emails from the AMLE paper, the response to my book as well, all of that suggests to me that there's a hunger and an enthusiasm for making things a little bit better in our field. So it's not as if the overwhelming majority of management academics are presently happy with the state of the field and think that it is problem-free. There's a great awareness that many of these difficulties exist, and it's simply a question of turning that awareness into positive actions that can facilitate change. I would like to see journals, for example, adopting more openly this idea of 2 rounds of revision and then a decision about whether to accept it or not. That would be something institutionally that would greatly help. I don't know how we can achieve this, but I would certainly like to see journal ranking lists, if not abolished, and treated with the contempt that they have worked so hard to deserve, and which they fully deserve. But beyond that, this issue of responsible research, of more people getting together to talk about it, and making a commitment when they work together and in their own work to embrace those types of principles can have a very profound impact on the field.
Oh, I can't tell you how glad I am to hear that. I'm really glad you've seen some positive responses. Well, Dennis, I want to thank you for your work, because I think your work is just necessary. It is a liminal time for us to change into a better future. And the work that you do helps us to do that. So thank you for what you're doing. Please keep doing that. Do you have any upcoming material that you want to publish or write, or that you are writing on this topic?
Not at the moment, but I have other research projects that, in my view, are addressing really important issues out there. So I'm trying to practice what I preach.
And so it's time for you to spread the word as well. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think what you're doing is awesome and important. I will try to paste all the sources to the reference that we mentioned in the description down below of this video. And with that, thanks again, and take care, Dennis.
Thank you, Alex. Really enjoyed talking to you.